I stepped into my daughter's dining room and set my coat on the back of the nearest chair. The house felt unusually still, the kind of quiet that makes you pay attention without meaning to. She stood at the table with a stack of documents already laid out in front of her. Before I asked why they were there, she pushed them toward me and said, "Dad, don't ask questions, just sign." The words hit harder than her tone. She wouldn't look me in the eye, and her hand trembled as she nudged the pen across the table. I was used to seeing her stressed, but this wasn't stress. This was fear trying to disguise itself. She kept glancing toward the hallway, as if expecting someone to appear, her eyes sharp and restless. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. I didn't reach for the papers. I'm a man in my late 60s, patient by nature but not blind. I watched her, and the more she avoided my gaze, the more uneasy I felt spreading across my chest. The documents weren't thick, but she handled them as if they carried weight far greater than paper ever should. My hand hovered near the pen, not touching it. When I finally leaned back slightly, she let out a quick breath, almost a plea, and pressed her palm flat against the table. "Please, Dad," she said, softer this time. "Just sign it so we can move on." Her voice cracked around the edges. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was something closer to desperation, and it made my pulse slow in a way I didn't like. A sharp knock at the front door cut through the room. My daughter stiffened immediately, her shoulders rising and locking as if someone had pulled a string at the base of her spine. She didn't move to answer it. She looked at me instead, wide-eyed, as though hoping I would tell her what to do. The knock came again, firmer this time. Before either of us spoke, the door opened and an auditor stepped inside with a badge clipped to his belt. He paused when he saw me at the table and the stack of documents between us. His expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes sharpened. He closed the door gently behind him and walked in with measured steps, the room shrinking around the three of us. My daughter's breathing quickened. She pressed the documents closer to her side, almost shielding them with her body. The auditor didn't look at her. Not yet. He kept his focus on me, studying the situation with a steady, practiced gaze. I felt my heartbeat slow into something deeper, heavier, waiting for him to speak. When he reached the edge of the table, he finally lifted his eyes from the papers to my face. His voice was low, direct, and stripped of anything that might soften the moment. "Sir, did you agree to these terms?" The question wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to stop everything else in the room. My daughter flinched. Her hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as if she were holding on to something slipping out of her control. She didn't answer for me, and the silence that followed made the air feel colder. I didn't touch the documents. I didn't touch the pen. I kept my hands in my lap, steady and deliberate, letting the tension settle where it wanted. The auditor waited. My daughter's eyes darted between us, and in that quiet, I realized the visit I thought was casual had turned into something far more complicated, something I hadn't been invited to understand, only to sign away. The danger wasn't loud. It sat quietly on the table, waiting for the smallest move. I sat in my car outside her house for a long minute before leaving, letting the engine idle while my thoughts tried to settle into something understandable. The documents, the trembling in her hand, the auditor's quiet question, it all brushed against something deeper I'd tried to ignore. As I pulled onto the main road, memories rose with a heaviness that felt older than the day itself. I had raised that girl after my wife died, learning how to braid hair, pack lunches, and soothe nightmares the best I could. She had been stubborn even then, but loyal in a way that made every hard moment worth it. As the years moved on, the closeness we once shared thinned in ways I couldn't measure at first. Missed calls became normal. Conversations shrank to one-line replies, the kind you send while doing something else. She started visiting less, always claiming work or stress or schedules that didn't let her slow down. I didn't push her. Adults drift, and I thought she needed her space. But somewhere in that distance, something changed, and I didn't realize it until too late. A few months ago, she came to my house with a different tone. She said she wanted to help manage some of Dad's things, as if my life was a set of loose files she needed to organize. She spoke in a way that didn't sound like her. Sharp, overly confident, rehearsed. She brushed aside my questions, claiming it was for convenience, that I didn't need to worry about the details. I felt a shift then, faint but steady, like a door quietly closing behind me. I later learned she wasn't alone in that change. She had a new boyfriend, a man I had only met once in passing. He shook my hand with a grip too firm, the kind people use when they're trying to prove something. He talked over her, finished her sentences, and watched me with a strange awareness, as if assessing more than introducing himself. After that day, her decisions started sounding like echoes of someone else's advice. It wasn't dramatic, just different enough to notice. When I think back on the years after her mother died, I remember a girl who would sit next to me on the couch, head on my shoulder, asking questions no one her age should have had to ask. We built a life from scratch, the two of us figuring out how to carry grief without letting it drown us. I trusted her completely, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it through every shared routine and every small moment of honesty. That trust made today's silence cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I parked the car in my driveway and stayed there for a while, staring at the front steps where she once ran with scraped knees and school papers. The house looked the same, but something inside me felt different, emptier in places I didn't expect. I walked inside and hung my keys on the hook, listening to the quiet settle around me. There's a loneliness that hits harder when you're older. It doesn't come with tears or collapse. It comes with the realization that the person you once protected might now be hiding something from you. I sat at the table, hands folded, letting the evening light fill the room. That's when a memory surfaced, one that had brushed past me weeks ago, but didn't make sense until now. She had come by with a forced smile and said, "Dad, you should let me handle your accounts. It's easier if I take care of things from now on." She said it lightly, as if it were a suggestion, not a direction. At the time, I laughed it off. Today the words landed differently. The sting wasn't just in what she asked, but in what it meant. Something had shifted between us, without my seeing it, and whatever she was trying to push forward now had roots far deeper than today's documents. I spread the documents across my kitchen table that night, flattening each page with the palm of my hand. The stack looked incomplete the moment I opened it. Several pages were missing, sections cut off mid-sentence, signature blocks without explanations, terms that didn't match the titles. It felt like reading a book where someone had torn out every chapter that mattered. I traced the stapled corner and saw uneven marks, as if the papers had been rearranged by someone in a hurry. The silence in the house made the gaps feel even louder. As I picked up the top page, my phone buzzed on the counter. A notification flashed across the screen. Your password was reset. I stared at it, waiting for the alert to disappear, wondering if my memory was failing or if someone had just slipped further into parts of my life I hadn't given permission to. I opened my email, but the reset link was already expired. The strangeness of the timing made a cold pressure settle in my chest. I sent my daughter a message, asking if she knew anything about the reset. Her reply came quickly, too quickly, and carried none of the warmth she used to show. "Probably nothing," she wrote. "I'm busy. Talk later." No explanation, no reassurance. Just the kind of dismissive response that closes a door rather than opens one. I tried calling, but she didn't answer. The call rang until it cut itself off. I returned to the papers and found something I hadn't noticed earlier. A photocopy tucked behind one of the half-completed forms. It looked cleaner than the rest, printed on brighter paper. A financial document. My name was listed at the top, but under primary decision maker, her name appeared instead of mine. I hadn't signed anything that would make her responsible for my financial choices. I knew that with the same certainty, I knew the layout of my own home. A small chill worked its way down my arms. I checked the envelope again, but found no explanation, no supporting documents, nothing that justified why she would be listed in that role. The realization crawled through my mind slowly, steady and unwelcome. Someone had filled in details I hadn't agreed to. I turned on the lamp in the living room and sat at my desk, opening my banking portal. After verifying 3 different codes, the page loaded. The mailing address displayed on the screen wasn't mine. It showed her street number. Subtle, only a few digits changed, but enough to redirect statements and alerts. I leaned back in the chair, letting the information settle, each piece clicking into place with a quiet finality I wasn't ready for. Later that evening, while taking out the trash, I ran into my neighbor, an older man who spent most of his time tending to his small garden. He made a casual remark about seeing my daughter's boyfriend on my porch earlier in the week. He mentioned how the man had taken a few envelopes, saying he was helping out. My neighbor didn't think much of it, but the words hit me with a slow, heavy weight. I hadn't asked anyone to pick up my mail. I hadn't been expecting anyone that day. I thanked him and walked back inside, closing the door behind me with more care than necessary. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint ticking of the thermostat. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden fear, no rush of panic, just a steady, growing discomfort, like a thread being pulled tighter one small tug at a time. I went back to the table and looked at the scattered documents. The altered address, the photocopied form listing her as the decision maker, the hurried replies, the unexplained password reset. None of it screamed danger on its own. But together, they shaped a quiet pattern that didn't belong to chance. Something was moving beneath the surface of my life. Slow, careful, deliberate. And for the first time, I began to see its outline. Early the next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with the bank's customer service number pulled up on my phone. The documents from the night before were stacked neatly beside me, each page a quiet reminder that something in my life had shifted without my permission. I took a slow breath before calling, steadying my voice as the automated menu clicked through its options. When a representative finally answered, I explained that I needed a detailed account history, including any changes made in the past month. There was a long pause on the other end. Long enough for me to hear her tapping through records, long enough for doubt to settle deeper into my stomach. When she finally spoke, her tone had tightened. She said there had been recent authorization forms submitted on my account. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. The hesitation in her voice told me everything I needed to know. I requested printed records for pickup and thanked her. She ended the call quickly, almost relieved. I stayed seated for a few minutes, letting the quiet stretch across the room. The light from the window hit the table in a thin line, enough for me to see the dust that had settled overnight. I pushed myself up and walked toward my bedroom, feeling a growing heaviness I couldn't shake. My desk drawer was where I kept anything important: old insurance forms, tax papers, my will, photocopies of IDs. I slid it open slowly. The drawer wasn't empty, but it wasn't right. Several folders were shifted, and the envelope containing my legal documents was thinner than it should have been. I lifted each file carefully, checking for the papers I knew should be there. Some were missing entirely. Others had been placed out of order. When I reached the back of the drawer, I found a small stack of photocopies tucked behind an old checkbook. I pulled them into the light. My signature appeared at the bottom of each page, but the lines weren't mine, not the way I wrote them. The slant was wrong. The pressure uneven. One signature curved upward where mine always curved down. They were close enough for someone unfamiliar to accept, but to me, they looked like an imitation, wearing the mask of familiarity. A cold calm moved through me, clearing away whatever hope I had been holding on to. I carried the stack to the living room and opened my laptop. The screen glowed softly in the dim room as I typed in my email password. It felt strange to suspect my own child of anything more than impatience, but the evidence on my desk pushed the thought into reality. I searched my inbox for her name. A thread of messages appeared, most of them updates from places she shouldn't have been contacting. I clicked the first one. It was a message from my bank, forwarded to her, stating that she had requested exclusive updates regarding my account. The next email was similar, another request for account notifications to be redirected. A third message referenced temporary management access, something I had never heard of. As I read, a sinking clarity took hold. These weren't automated errors. They weren't clerical mistakes. They were steps, small, calculated, intentional. With each message, the shape of the situation sharpened. My daughter hadn't pushed these changes alone. The tone of the requests, the matching timestamps, the organized sequence. They felt too coordinated for someone unfamiliar with financial procedures. I remembered her boyfriend's steady gaze the day I met him, how he studied me quietly as she spoke. I had dismissed it then. Now it replayed with new meaning. I closed the laptop and set it on the table. The house was still, but the stillness no longer felt safe. There was a pattern now, unmistakable and deliberate. Papers missing, signatures altered, accounts redirected. None of it accidental, none of it harmless. Someone was moving pieces behind my back, and the hand guiding those pieces was uncomfortably close. The alert came while I was making coffee, the phone buzzing sharply on the counter. I picked it up expecting another routine notification, but the words stopped me cold. Your loan application has been submitted. I stared at the screen, reading it twice, then a third time, waiting for it to make sense. I hadn't applied for anything. I hadn't spoken to the bank since the call about authorization forms. A slow heaviness settled in my chest, the kind that warns you something has crossed a line you didn't know existed. Before I could pull up my account, the doorbell rang, 2 quick presses that sounded impatient. When I opened the door, my daughter stood there, breathing fast, her eyes darting past me like she wasn't sure whether she should come in or run. She stepped inside without waiting, asking where the documents were. Her voice was too sharp, too practiced, and her hands clenched at her sides, as if she was preparing to grab something before I could think. I walked toward the dining table, not answering. She followed close, a little too close, the tension coming off her in waves. When she saw the papers laid out, the photocopies, the emails, the account details, her face tightened. She reached for them instantly, but I placed my hand on the stack before she could sweep them into her bag. Her reaction wasn't frustration. It was panic disguised as concern. She kept saying there had been confusion and miscommunication, but her voice cracked around the edges, tripping over explanations that didn't match what I already knew. She wasn't here to clarify anything. She was here to contain something. The realization pushed deeper when she demanded to know how much I had read, her tone rising for a moment before she caught herself. I opened a drawer and pulled out the document I had found behind the others, a competency evaluation form. My personal information was already filled in, written in neat blocks, the sections describing diminished capacity bolded as if they needed emphasis. My signature, or rather the imitation of it, sat crooked on the line. When she saw the paper, her expression shifted from panic to something brittle and exhausted, like a person whose plan had been exposed too early. She tried to speak, but the words tangled together. I didn't push her to explain. The paper said enough. A faint sound drifted in from the hallway, a whisper, low and hurried. I stepped closer to the doorway, and her boyfriend's voice carried through the half-open window. "Did you get them? We need to move fast. His assets won't wait forever, and the timeline is tight." His tone wasn't cruel. It was calculating. That made it worse. My daughter froze when she realized I had heard him. She didn't rush outside, didn't call him off, didn't deny anything. She just stood there, breathing shallowly, her eyes wide in a way that made the room feel smaller. She whispered my name once, barely audible, but not to apologize, only to gauge how much I understood. I gathered the papers into a neat stack. Every detail lined up now, missing pages, altered signatures, redirected messages, unauthorized requests, the sudden urgency to manage my accounts, and now a loan application I hadn't touched. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a structure, built piece by piece behind my back. The house felt different as I stepped away from the table. Not hostile, but colder somehow, as if the trust that once filled it had drained without a sound. I looked at her and saw not the child I raised, but someone who had stepped onto a path that left me behind. The truth settled with a finality I couldn't soften. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't care. This was a takeover. Quiet, intentional, and already in motion. I sat outside the attorney's office for a few minutes before going in, watching people pass on the sidewalk with the kind of easy confidence I no longer felt. The folder on the seat beside me held every altered form, every email, every photocopied signature, evidence I never imagined I would gather against my own child. When I finally walked through the glass door, the receptionist guided me to a quiet room with dim lighting and shelves lined with legal books. The stillness in that space made each breath feel harder than the last. The attorney entered with a calm, measured presence. He was older, steady in the way people become when they've seen situations like mine too many times. He shook my hand, sat across from me, and asked what brought me in. I placed the folder between us and told him I needed someone to explain what I was looking at. He opened it carefully, turning each page with practiced focus, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. His silence stretched on, not because he was unsure, but because he was confirming what he already recognized. When he finally looked up, his expression didn't soften. He said the signatures weren't mine, not legally, not structurally, not even stylistically. He pointed out the slant inconsistencies, the pressure marks, the sudden changes in formatting. Anyone trained in exploitation cases, he said, would recognize the pattern immediately. The documents weren't just altered. They were designed to be slipped into a larger plan. Hearing it laid out in clean, factual terms made the truth settle deeper than emotion ever could. He explained how these situations typically unfold. First, someone redirects communication, mail, email, notifications. Then they update account access. After that come the evaluations, with forged signatures or manipulated consent. Once those steps are in place, financial moves follow. Loans, asset transfers, beneficiary changes. Each step small enough to look harmless when isolated, but devastating when aligned. I listened without interrupting, each point falling into place with a chilling precision. When he reached the competency evaluation, he tapped the page twice. "This," he said, "isn't a misunderstanding. This is preparation." He looked directly at me, his words steady and unembellished. "They're preparing to take over your decisions." The sentence didn't raise its voice. It didn't need to. It carried the weight of a verdict. He advised immediate action. Documents needed to be secured. Birth certificate, will, identification, bank records. Accounts required new layers of protection. Access had to be restricted, passwords changed, notifications rerouted. He listed each step calmly, as if reading from a checklist designed to salvage what was left before it slipped out of reach. I nodded slowly, absorbing every instruction, not because I wanted to, but because I no longer had the luxury of trust. Then he showed me something on his screen. The loan attempt had been filed shortly after the account changes were made. The timing wasn't accidental. It followed the typical sequence. Establish control, then act. He wasn't surprised. I was. But the shock didn't come with noise. It arrived quietly, settling under my skin like a chill that wouldn't leave. He didn't offer comfort. He offered clarity, which felt sharper but more necessary. He said I wasn't powerless, but the window to protect myself was narrowing. This was the moment to step in, not step back. His tone carried no drama, just the reality of what happens when someone close shifts from family to threat. When I left his office, the air outside felt colder than when I'd arrived. I walked slowly to my car, gripping the folder with a steadiness that came from decision, not strength. The path ahead wasn't about understanding motives anymore. It was about survival, legal, financial, personal. As I sat in the driver's seat, a quiet truth settled in. This was the point of no return. Not chosen, not invited, but unavoidable. I spent the next morning locking down every part of my life that could be moved without my knowledge. I changed passwords, added verification layers, and placed every important document, birth certificate, will, passport, into a metal box the attorney had recommended. The box felt heavier than its contents, as if it carried the weight of a truth I hadn't wanted to see. When I slid it onto the top shelf of my closet, something inside me settled. Not comfort, just readiness. By noon, my daughter had called 3 times. When I finally answered, her voice came through sharp and impatient. She demanded updates, asking whether I had signed anything, whether I had gone through the paperwork. She didn't ask if I was all right. She didn't ask why I hadn't responded earlier. She only wanted access, as if my life were an account she needed to log into. I kept my tone steady, offering nothing she could twist. She grew colder with each sentence, irritation slipping through the careful edge of her voice. Later that afternoon, her boyfriend called from a blocked number. He didn't bother with small talk. He told me it would save everyone time if I signed the power of attorney and got it over with. His tone carried a strange confidence, like he believed the decision had already been made and my signature was just a final formality. I let him talk, keeping the phone on speaker while recording the call with another device in my lap. His words didn't shake, they presumed. And that presumption told me more than anything else. That evening, they both showed up at my door. My daughter stood in front, arms crossed, trying to appear composed. The boyfriend stood behind her with the posture of a man who thought control was something he could hold in both hands. They asked to come in. I stepped aside without expression. I didn't want a scene. I wanted the truth laid out cleanly, without noise. They sat at the table where the documents had once been spread. My daughter leaned forward, asking why I was making things difficult and whether I had reconsidered signing. Her boyfriend added that delays create problems, as though my own autonomy were an inconvenience. I listened, nodding slowly, letting the recording device run inside my pocket. Their words unfolded with the same coordinated rhythm I had begun to expect. At one point, my daughter's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, hesitated, then turned the screen face down. When she excused herself to the hallway, I heard her whispering urgently. After they left, I checked her device history through an old shared app we'd used years ago. What I found wasn't a coincidence. It was an email chain between the two of them. The subject line read, "Asset Division Plan." My address was listed in the body. My home, the place I'd built with my late wife, brick by cautious brick, grief by careful grief. They weren't just planning around my future. They were planning around my absence. I sat at the table long after they were gone, the room quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. The betrayal wasn't just administrative. It was personal, threaded through years of trust I had handed over without hesitation. A man doesn't raise a child expecting her to turn him into a ledger. Yet here I was, staring at proof that my life had been sorted into columns. For a few minutes, the weight of it pressed harder than anything I'd felt since my wife passed. I wondered where I had failed, not as a man, but as a father. I didn't let the thought sit too long. Regret wouldn't help me now. What mattered was the next step, the line I needed to hold. I placed the recordings, emails, and altered documents into a secure folder. The confrontation was coming. I could feel it in the stillness of the room, in the quiet resolve settling into my bones. There was no fear now, only clarity. I was ready. I called my daughter the next day and told her I needed help with something around the house. My voice was steady, giving nothing away. She agreed without hesitation, almost relieved, as if she thought the resistance of the past few days had finally worn me down. I set the documents neatly on the dining table, the forged signatures, the altered pages, the forwarded emails, each one placed carefully, waiting for the moment she walked through the door. When she arrived, she stepped inside with a kind of forced ease, glancing quickly around the room before her eyes landed on the table. She froze. The color in her face shifted, not dramatically, but enough for me to see the panic rising behind her calm expression. She asked what this was, her voice thin, stretched over something she couldn't hide. I gestured for her to sit. She didn't. Instead, she moved closer, reaching for the papers with a sharpness that betrayed her fear. I kept my hand on the edge of the stack. She pulled back slightly, swallowing hard. Then the excuses began. She said she hadn't known about the documents. She said someone must have mixed things up. She said the bank, the clinic, the mail, everything had made errors. Her words came fast, stumbling over each other. The panic wasn't in the explanation. It was in the pace. When those excuses failed, she shifted the blame. She said her boyfriend handled most of the paperwork, that he misunderstood what she was asking for, that she had trusted the wrong person. Her hands shook now, not with guilt, but with the fear of being caught. She said his name the way someone uses a shield, hiding behind it rather than offering truth. Before I could respond, the front door opened without knocking. Her boyfriend walked in with the kind of careless confidence that comes from believing he belongs in places he shouldn't. He saw the papers on the table, and his expression tightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He stepped forward, speaking quickly, telling me it was best if we settled everything now. He placed a fresh set of POA forms in front of me, as though he were doing me a favor. Their voices layered, hers urging me softly, his pressing harder. They pushed explanations, justifications, warnings about future complications, all circling the same goal. They weren't yelling. They weren't threatening. They were cornering me with polished words, hoping to wear down my resistance. The room felt smaller with each sentence. I let them talk. I waited. And when the moment felt right, I lifted my phone from the edge of the table and tapped the screen. Their own voices filled the room, recordings of conversations they didn't know I captured. Their talk of asset division, timelines, fast access, and getting him to sign before anything changes. The boyfriend's face drained of its confidence. My daughter's breath hitched as the sound played on. When the recordings ended, I told them I had already met with an attorney. The boyfriend took half a step back, his eyes darting toward the door. My daughter's shoulders dropped, not in surrender, but in the quiet collapse of a facade she could no longer hold upright. She stared at the papers on the table as though seeing them for the first time. The denial that shaped her earlier words fell away, leaving her face exposed in a way I hadn't seen in years, not childlike, not remorseful, but stripped of pretense. She tried to speak, but the words never formed. The boyfriend muttered something under his breath and turned away, unable to salvage the moment. The silence that filled the room afterward wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, final, The kind of silence that settles when the truth stands fully uncovered, with no place left to hide. I gathered the papers without looking at either of them. The confrontation wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was simply the moment when everything became undeniable. The morning after the confrontation, I walked into the attorney's office carrying the thick folder that had become a strange extension of my own hand. He didn't need a long explanation. I laid the papers on his desk, and he read through them with the same steady focus he had shown the first time. When he reached the recording transcripts, he nodded once, the kind of nod that meant the situation had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Without ceremony, he began drafting the exploitation complaints, typing with a precision that felt both clinical and necessary. When he finished, he slid the documents across the desk for my signature. I read each line slowly, not because I doubted him, but because the weight of what I was doing deserved deliberate attention. These weren't just forms. They were acknowledgments of what my daughter had become involved in. I signed where he pointed, my hand steady. He submitted the filings through a secure portal, the soft click of the mouse sounding heavier than it should have. 2 investigators came to my home later that week. They sat on my couch, notebooks open, voices calm and respectful. They asked for details, timelines, copies of the altered paperwork, and the recordings. When they interviewed my daughter, they told me she tried to shift the blame, claiming confusion, claiming pressure, claiming her boyfriend had mishandled everything. But the investigators had the documents. They had her login trail. They had the recording where she pushed for control she had no right to request. Her excuses didn't stretch far enough to cover the facts. The boyfriend didn't manage any better. He tried to frame everything as help gone wrong, but his tone, the messages, and the email chain labeled Asset Division Plan painted a clearer picture than anything he could invent. The investigators took their statements, cataloged every contradiction, and gathered the evidence without dramatics. No raised voices, no big confrontations, just procedure settling into motion with quiet certainty. A few days later, the bank called me directly. The representative apologized for what had happened and confirmed multiple unauthorized login attempts tied to my daughter's profile. Some were attempts to alter access settings, others were attempts to initiate transfers. They had locked every questionable action and flagged the account for fraud protection. They assured me she and the boyfriend would no longer have any link, formal or informal, to my information. I thanked them, though the relief came with a hollow ache. Back at the attorney's office, I updated everything that needed updating. We revised my will, removed her from any future authority, and added protections to ensure no one, child, relative, or stranger, could alter my decisions without my explicit approval. We added secondary verifications, notarized safeguards, and a clause that required independent oversight for any major change. The legal language was cold, but the necessity behind it felt painfully human. When the paperwork was done, I sat there for a moment, holding the pen loosely between my fingers. This wasn't how I imagined the later years of my life. I thought trust would carry me, that the child I raised would walk beside me through whatever time I had left. Instead, I sat in a law office, protecting myself from the person I once carried on my shoulders. The grief didn't come with tears. It arrived as a quiet heaviness in my chest, settling into a place I knew it would remain. I left the building in the late afternoon. The air outside was cool, steady, indifferent to the storm that had passed through my life. I walked to my car with the new documents secured in a folder under my arm. Each step felt measured, not because I was weak, but because the moment demanded respect. I felt safer. I felt protected. But I also felt the sharp edge of something lost, something that would never return. When I closed the car door, the sound echoed softly. It wasn't closure. It was simply the truth settling in. The days after everything settled felt strangely quiet, as if the house needed time to adjust to the truth I had finally faced. I moved through each room with a slower, more deliberate awareness. Betrayal doesn't arrive with noise or warnings. It grows in the spaces you don't watch closely. Routine favors, casual trust, familiar silences. I had spent years believing the quiet between my daughter and me was harmless, the natural distance of adulthood. Only now did I understand how easily that same quiet could hide something darker. I sat at the kitchen table one morning, hands wrapped around a warm mug, and thought about how I had mistaken loyalty for safety. I used to believe vulnerability came with age, that growing older made a person easy to take advantage of. But it wasn't age that opened the door. It was trust, the kind built over decades of shared moments, small promises, and a belief that family would always protect its own. That belief had blinded me to the signs until they were impossible to ignore. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. A person doesn't lose their independence in one dramatic moment. It slips away quietly, tucked inside unasked favors and "let me handle that" conversations. I had allowed that space to grow without noticing how much ground it covered. So I began telling myself the things I wished someone had told me years earlier. Guard your documents, read everything twice, and question sudden offers of help no matter how gentle the voice behind them sounds. Staying alert isn't distrust, it's survival. With each passing day, I rebuilt my routines piece by piece. I organized documents into labeled folders, placing them on a high shelf where only I knew the order. I cleaned out drawers, removed old copies, shredded what needed to disappear. These small actions gave me back a sense of control I didn't realize I had lost. I cooked simple meals again, watered the plants my wife once tended, and sat in the backyard during the early evenings, letting the quiet settle in without suspicion. When I returned to the bank, I walked in with my head steady, knowing every choice was mine alone. The representative updated my information without hesitation, asking for my confirmation at each step. There was no interference, no redirected mail, no confusion, only clean, straightforward control. Later, when I visited the clinic, I signed my own forms, reviewed my own records, and adjusted my contacts with the same careful precision I now brought to every part of my life. Standing at the counter, I felt a quiet peace I hadn't experienced in months. On the drive home, the late afternoon sun slanted across the road, and I thought of my wife. We had built our life slowly, deliberately, carrying each challenge together. Protecting what we built wasn't just about documents or accounts. It was about honoring the years that shaped us, the home that held us, and the values we tried to pass on. Even if my daughter had chosen a path I couldn't follow, I still had the responsibility to secure what remained. Back at the house, I placed the last set of protected documents in the drawer I now kept locked. I stood for a moment, letting the weight of the past months settle without bitterness. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken. I felt steady, older, wiser, and aware of the line I had learned to draw. Growing old had never been the real danger. Age doesn't take your life from you. Trust does, when it's placed in the wrong hands. Growing old isn't the danger. Trusting the wrong person is.